Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Christina Ewig. I'm the Faculty Director of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, University of Minnesota. Our event today, Can Guaranteed Income Advance Gender Equity, is co-hosted with the City of St. Paul. And I want to extend a special thanks to our partners at the City of St. Paul's Office of Financial Empowerment for working with us to organize this event. Today's conversation is also part of the Women's Health, Equity, Empowerment, and Leadership Series, which is an interdisciplinary collaboration here at the University of Minnesota, designed to share perspectives on the intersection of disparities in women's health, public policy, human rights, ethics, and more. I'd also like to begin our event today by acknowledging that we live, learn, and work each day on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary land of Indigenous peoples. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on Dakota land, ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. We do this land acknowledgement at the start of our events as one way to educate our campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and each other. An acknowledgement of this history also connects to our event today. We have systematic racial and economic disparities that programs like Guaranteed Income seek to address. And these disparities are in part rooted in histories of land dispossession. So we're hosting this event now at this point in time because it's just about 1 year ago that St. Paul joined a growing national movement for guaranteed income programs when it launched the People's Prosperity Guaranteed Income Pilot. This program provides up to 150 families $500 a month in guaranteed income for up to 18 months. And plans are also currently underway to start a similar project in the city of Minneapolis. So the timing for this event is critical. It's a moment to both reflect on the impact of the St. Paul project and also to carefully consider the design of future similar projects in Minneapolis and elsewhere. Guaranteed income policies and related universal basic income proposals have also drawn support from both left and right, so they're unusual in that respect. The left sees them as a fresh way to address economic inequality, while the right has seen them as an alternative up to other social supports, being able to collapse the varied programs we have in subsidized housing, for example, or healthcare, and consolidate into one program. And left and right has generally looked at the impact of guaranteed income programs on poverty. But we hear less about the potential impacts of these kinds of policies on gender inequalities. So the goal in today's conversation is to put a spotlight on the impacts of guaranteed income policies on gender inequalities. For example, is it possible for US-based guaranteed income projects to be effective tools in addressing gender inequality, especially as these intersect with other structures of inequality like race or class? What has been the experience of St. Paul and other pilot projects around the country? And how does guaranteed income compare to universal basic income when it comes to addressing gender inequalities and their intersections with other inequalities? So these are some of the questions we're going to address today with an esteemed group of panelists. So now let me turn to introducing our panelists. We have with us today Mayor Melvin Carter. Melvin Carter is the 46th and first African-American mayor of the city of St. Paul, Minnesota's capital city. Carter was elected in 2018. He's also an alumnus of the Humphrey School, where he earned his Master of Public Policy. As a founding member and co-chair of the nonprofit Mayors for a Guaranteed Income group, Mayor Carter initiated St. Paul's Guaranteed Income pilot project called the People's Prosperity Project. We also have with us today Dr. Amy Castro. Dr. Castro is an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the School of Social Policy and Practice. She's also the founding director of the Center for Guaranteed Income at the University of Pennsylvania. She's been evaluating the impact of both the Stockton, California pilot and St. Paul's Guaranteed Income pilot projects. Finally, we have Dr. Almaz Zelleke. Dr. Zelleke is a professor of practice and political science at New York University, Shanghai. Her research focuses on the ethics and implementation of basic income, and she's currently working on a book on feminist perspectives on basic income. Dr. Zelleke also serves on the International Advisory Board of the Basic Income Earth Network, and on the board of advisors of the U.S. Basic Income Guarantee Network. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Before I move into the conversation, let me make one housekeeping note to all of our audience members. The chat function is disabled, but please use the Q&A function to ask your questions for the speakers. I'm going to be checking those throughout our conversation, and I'll do my best to weave your questions into our conversation. The live transcription has also been enabled through Zoom on this event. So let me begin with Mayor Carter. Mayor Carter, can you tell us what motivated you to pilot a guaranteed income program in St. Paul, this People's Prosperity Project? And was gender equity at all part of your thinking when you decided to launch this program?
Well, listen, thank you for having me on. It's great to be a part of this conversation. Always good to be virtually back in my home of the Humphrey School, where I, got an incredible background in tools for thinking through policies like these. Always great to have be on with these two panelists who know far more than I ever will about this topic. But what I'll tell you where we started was saying, listen, this is critical for us. We know that we live in an area that has increased in its diversity significantly. We know we live in an area that has increased in its population, and we know we live in an era in which literally everyone has spent some time, at least in the last 20 months, desperate and in crisis and in trauma. We know that trauma is going to play out even more pronounced in our communities of color. We know that trauma is going to play out even more pronounced in low-income communities. We know that trauma is going to play out even more pronounced among women, and of all of the groups of Americans who have always borne the brunt of the crisis of the trauma that America faces. In the African American community, there's a saying that when America catches a cold, Black Americans have the flu. And we know that's how disparities play out. So yes, gender equity, racial equity, economic equity, all of those things that are so intersectional that it's very difficult to really cleanly detach them from one another, was a very core part of our thinking as we approach this. Mayor Michael Tubbs, who's the former mayor of Stockton, California, which is the first American city to launch a guaranteed income pilot, has been a friend of mine for a very long time, someone I've looked up to who has done incredible work, I think. And this is something that, he's been updating me as they built their pilot in Stockton over the past several years. And it's something that I was very intrigued by, and it just makes sense. When we think about poverty, there's this enormous discourse in America that pretends poverty exists because there are people who lack character or something like that, when we know the truth is poverty exists because people don't have enough money. And all of the things that we tie to poverty in America exist because people don't have enough money. And so if people have a little bit more money at the end of the month, we can address all of those things that we marry to poverty as though they're sort of God-created forces of nature that we have to live with. And so long story short, Mayor Tubbs approached me and said, hey, there's an opportunity to think about this national network. There's an opportunity to expand pilots. We were excited. We decided St. Paul was going to be second. We were the second city to launch a pilot, the first one to launch it with public funds. Really proud of our ability to do that last year with CARES Act dollars, especially because I think we paved the way for other cities to think about how they do it this year with American Rescue Plan dollars. And we've seen this network grow from, I think, 11 initially to somewhere around 60 right now. And it's just exciting to see this progress move forward. I think we're going to be able to show, like Stockton has, that this simple policy can make some really profound impacts on life for Americans all over our country, and that it's somewhat of a no-brainer for our state capitals, for our state legislatures, and for our federal administration to support as a way to transform people's lives across our country and therefore transform the future of our whole country.
Thank you, Mayor Carter. So let me turn a bit to Dr. Castro at this point. Let's step back and have some definitions here. What is guaranteed income? We also often hear this term, universal basic income. What is the difference between the two? And is one a stop on the way to the other, or are they completely different animals? Give us some basic background to begin our conversation on.
Yeah, so also thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, that's a great place to start, right? And I think part of the reason we have to set the stage with terms is because one of the issues we're having right now is that public conversation around cash is moving faster than our ability to sort of have a shared language around it. So oftentimes the term people hear most frequently is UBI, or universal basic income. And what that term means is exactly what it sounds like. It's universal, meaning the amount of money that would be given is fixed, it's recurring, and it goes to everybody in a particular city, town, county, country, choose your area, right? We actually haven't tested a truly universal UBI yet. There's variations on that, but a truly universal one hasn't happened yet here in the United States. Basic income, the way that term typically is applied, meaning it's again a fixed amount of money you can rely on each month or week or whatever the cadence is, but it would cover your basic needs, those basic things that you need. And a guaranteed income is a little bit different. It's just a fixed amount of money that's recurring that you can rely on whatever that cadence is, be it weekly, monthly, for 2 years. Probably the thing we have closest to universality right now in the United States, is, although it wouldn't quite fit the definition, is a child tax credit, which really functions very similarly to a guaranteed income. I do think that these things are a bit of a potentially a bit of a stop on the way to a UBI. I think it's sort of the jury's out. There's a lot of questions that we still have to ask and answer about implementation and policy take up, and particularly, again, to your topic, race and gender, right? Is that when we design policies around UBI, guaranteed income, or basic income, and we don't center women of color, particularly in that narrative, we risk locking people out, even if we get to that UBI. But I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit more later.
Okay, great. So now we've got three terms here: guaranteed income, basic income, universal basic income. And our focus here is honing in on the gender equity impacts. Dr. Zelleke, can you tell us, does it matter how these programs are designed, whether it is basic or basic guaranteed or universal, when it comes to addressing gender inequality issues? I mean, the mayor has said it's not about character, it's about resources. Does it matter how those resources are designed for disbursement?
Yes, and thank you also for including me in this wonderful and timely conversation. So I would just give a slightly different definition of basic income than Dr. Castro did, which is, in the philosophical discussions about basic income, the three characteristics, in addition to the fact that it's in cash and that it's given on a regular basis, as Dr. Castro mentioned, is that it is unconditional and it is individual and universal. In the context of that discussion, in sort of the academic philosophical world on basic income, the unconditionality is something that is, I think, pretty consistent across these different definitions. It's not dependent on having a job or looking for a job the way many of our traditional welfare state systems are. It's just unconditional. It goes to everybody who is eligible. And then in terms of universality, that's where it touches on eligibility. And what that means is that it goes to a broad swath of the population. It's not limited to particular demographic groups like veterans or retired people or mothers or families with newborns, but it's really meant to be as broad as possible. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean every single person in a society. It might be limited to citizens or permanent residents. It might exclude some of the very wealthiest, et cetera, but that it's broadly available to a wide group of people. And last, that it's individual. And it's really the individuality that I think has the strongest impact on gender equity. The fact that it's unconditional has effects for racial and class inequities, as well as gender inequities. The fact that it's universal for all three as well. But for women, the most important thing is that the income be assigned and calculated and delivered on an individual basis rather than on a household basis. We found from the studies that have occurred in other parts of the world that that individuality really makes a big difference, not only for families at the lower end of the income scale, but even for wealthier families where the family as a whole may be wealthy, but the woman, the wife, or even taking gender out of it, but the secondary earner or the person in the family who devotes themselves most to care rather than earned income has less voice and agency in the family. So that's a very important component to gender equality, which is that all members of a family or relationship or a household feel like they have a voice and a certain degree of autonomy and say in the family. And that's where the individual basis of a basic income could really make a difference. But the unconditionality is particularly important, I think, for racial disparities, because conditionality has been used in the past in this country to divide us into deserving and undeserving groups of people. The deserving people who really want to work and just they can't work for structural reasons, and then all those lazy people over there who don't want to work because they're just lazy. We know that that often has a racial tinge to it when we have those conversations. So the unconditionality is very important, particularly for African Americans. And then for class inequality, we need to talk not only about the benefit side, but also about the funding side. Who's paying for it? And if we fund it in a progressive way, then we can address class inequality as well.
Let's dig into that. I mean, that's really, you've laid out two pillars for these kinds of programs to really impact gender equity, that unconditionality and the individual delivery of the benefit. To what degree does the St. Paul program, and here I'm going to throw it to either Mayor Carter or Dr. Castro, who are studying the St. Paul program, fit those criteria? We know that it goes to, or I know that it goes to families with newborns, right? A small number of them. Is that conditional rather than unconditional? Does it go to the each adult in the household, or does it go to the family as a whole?
Thank you for the question, and I'm sure Dr. Castro will have a much more precise answer than mine is, as she always does when we do this roadshow together. Ours does go to the family. Ours is focused within a subset of a program that we call College Bound St. Paul. We created a program, a partnership here in St. Paul, through which we are starting every child born in our city with $50 in college savings accounts. And so we launched that in January of 2020. And so by definition, all of the members of our guaranteed income pilot are people who had a child born in the year 2020. So people who had a child less than 1 year old. As we think about the impacts on poverty in America, the cost of raising children, the cost of childcare, the cost of all of those costs that families take on when they have a child, is very relevant to the revolving doors that keep people stuck in poverty. And so there's another component, I think, that addresses directly the gender equity piece of it, because we know that oftentimes those costs are borne primarily by women. Our pilot is distributed on a household, on a family basis. And I'll tell you, 80% of the participants in our pilot are families of color. And that's something that I think is very important to see, that we are sort of hitting the mark of the families that we know that so many of our other programs have been missing. Unconditionality has been something that was an important, I think, criteria for us. One of the things that we know is, especially right now, listen, we have all of these programs, and the way we approach kind of poverty alleviation programs sort of always says, I think from a patronistic parental type of perspective, here's some money, but you can only use it on childcare. You can only use this on food. You can only use this on housing. You can only use this on healthcare. When in fact, that's not the way that's not the way any of our household budgets work. One family might need health supports or food supports. Another family might need childcare supports. And in fact, the family that needs help buying groceries this month could have a car breakdown next month and need an opportunity to figure out how to get that car fixed up and get to work, especially in a pandemic. We know that families are just hurting and families are just, in so much crisis. So having that unconditional cash transfer to say, listen, here's $500 to just help you get to the end of the month is really important. It's important to me because when my oldest daughter was born, we were on WIC. Which is, nutritional supports for women, infants, and children. And anyone who knows anything about WIC knows we could leave the grocery store every couple of weeks with more eggs, more milk, more cheese, and more peanut butter than we knew what to do with. But the challenge is my daughter was born with severe allergies to soy and dairy and a life-threatening allergy to peanuts. And so, many of the things that this conditional benefit would offer for our family, literally by definition, could not serve the child that it was intended to offer because of these conditions that somebody decided were right from City Hall or from the state capitol or from the nation's capital. The truth is families know what they need. And this is about investing in our families and not creating this paternalistic kind of approach to say from City Hall, from my office in City Hall, that we know better than you do what your child needs.
Dr. Castro, do you have anything to add to those comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mayor Carter covered it beautifully. The only thing I'd add is to say that sort of, something that we saw in Stockton, for instance, was that, it was open to sort of anybody who lived in the census tracts and received one of our mailers to apply to potentially be part of the treatment group. And we really ended up with an overrepresentation of women in the sample, as if anyone's following the project knows. And, at first it was sort of, well, why did that happen? What did we do? What went wrong? It's supposed to be random, right? But we know from decades of research that while men will list themselves as head of household, women are the ones who are performing all the unpaid care work. And that includes things like opening the mail, signing up for programs, paying the bills, dealing with conditional and unconditional programs, right? And so we do expect to see across all the pilots that we're working with, not just St. Paul's and Stockton, I would expect to see an overrepresentation of women, because women are the ones who, by and large, are performing those daily tasks that keep the family moving and keep the family running. The other thing I'd say is that what's really exciting to me about St. Paul is the fact that, again, they're using public dollars. And because even though it's not stating at the outset that this is a benefit that's specifically for women, by using public dollars at a program that by definition is essentially going to end up targeting women, just because the recruitment criteria includes families who just had a newborn, right? You're really seeing a prioritization of gender and a prioritization of care work with public dollars in a way that we haven't seen before. And so to me, as somebody who's been in this space for a little while, I mean, not certainly as long as Dr. Zelleke has, seeing the focus and even the question that we can say, we need to talk about gender, we need to talk about care work. This is a tremendous turn. And the fact that we're pairing that alongside things like the unconditional nature of basic income, meaning there's no means testing. We're not saying you have to work to get it. We're not saying you have to meet a particular set of criteria. You have to meet with a caseworker. That's not the case. We're saying, we trust women, and that ethos is very contrary to means tested benefits, which are really surrounded with shame and blame and a lot of assumptions about whether or not women, and particularly women of color, know best what their families need and know best how to leverage their resources.
I've got a question here from the audience. Why $500? What's the rationale behind that number? What objective does it serve? I'm thinking here, to elaborate a little bit, if I were someone on the ideological right that wanted to use this to replace other kinds of things like SNAP benefits, for example, 500 doesn't go that far, right? So why 500?
Yeah, that's a great question. So 500 is being used in St. Paul, and that's also the amount that was used in Stockton, has been used and is being used in a number of other pilots. Reason being is that for those of us that study income volatility, a standard question is, can you absorb a $400 emergency? That tends to be kind of a little bit of a baseline question of saying whether or not you have enough liquidity to absorb the shock of, say, a flat tire that causes you to miss a shift at work and can very quickly tumble a family into poverty because they miss rent or choose your thing, right, when you're living on the edge, paycheck to paycheck. So that's where that amount of money comes from. But one of the really open questions around this science is, how does that money move in different policy subsystems, right? And what should that amount of money be from one site to another? As a scientist, that's really kind of an open question. I will say that the work we're doing within CGIAR, we don't advocate for replacing the safety net. The math doesn't work for starters, and philosophically, it doesn't align with the way that we're approaching the work. But that's where that 500 comes from. I'm glad that somebody asked.
All right, so I'm gonna keep you on a bit, Dr. Castro, because I know that you've come out with an evaluation of the Stockton project. I don't know how far along your evaluations of the St. Paul project are, but maybe starting with Stockton, is there anything in your evaluation of it that can inform us about its impacts on gender equity?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't released all of our data yet on Stockton, so our final report will be coming out in spring of 2022. What we've released so far has been our first year findings from that's 1 year pre-pandemic data. And I really think there's two key findings from that first year of data that pertain to this topic in particular. First is the fact that families live in networks, right? They live in neighborhoods, they pool their resources. So even though the tax code and policy subsystems tend to say who's the head of household, we try to measure things by the nuclear family, even though most Americans don't live that way, and nor does most of the planet, right? People really live in networks. And so what we saw with that $500 in Stockton was that families really pooled those resources to patch holes throughout their social network. In many cases that really pertain to unpaid care work. So things like all that invisible work that women do that keep families moving, that keep the economy moving, that care for aging parents, for instance, who maybe cannot get themselves to the doctor. There's myriad of things that women do. We really actually don't know yet what that cost of care is. And so what we saw with Stockton was that women really use that $500 to function as a form of paid care work, to where it really patched those holes for things that they had always been doing, but hadn't been compensated to do. That would be one key piece. The second key piece was, in small ways, we really saw that money serve a bit of an emancipation effect. So when you're poor, by definition, you're constantly caught with lack of choice, right? It's do I choose bad option A or I choose bad option B? And this extends to sort of what I call my workforce vulnerability, is that it forces people to be vulnerable in relationships and to systems that they wouldn't otherwise. And so in some small ways, we saw that $500 actually opened up avenues from people to move out of forced vulnerability to chosen vulnerability or chosen interdependence, where they could say, these are the types of care work relationships that I want to be in. These are the type of romantic relationships that I want to be in. And there's been other data out there, particularly from the 70s, that showed that when we provided women with cash, no strings attached, they were able to leave violent relationships. So, while some would criticize, those experiments back in the 70s saying it caused divorce, it was like, no, you could also see it as reducing interpersonal violence. So those would be the two things that I would point to from Stockton, and we'll be, releasing more data on gender in spring 2022. And in St. Paul, it's a little bit too early to say.
Okay, thanks. But with that, I'm gonna pivot to Dr. Zelleke, who's knowledgeable about the variety of pilots that we've seen around the globe and their impact on gender equity. How does what Dr. Castro just described for the Stockton project compare to what you know about these kinds of pilots elsewhere in terms of their impact on gender equity?
I think it's similar to what we found elsewhere, and it's important when thinking about pilots in the other parts of the world, to distinguish between not only pilots that take place in developing economies versus developed economies, but also pilots that take place in sites that are able to be saturated with basic income in the policy lingo, which means that in a particular village, for example, in India, everybody in the village gets the basic income, as opposed to a more selective kind of pilot, as in Stockton or in St. Paul, for the obvious fiscal reasons. And as I said earlier, the results that we saw in India indicated that women, even in the more affluent families in a particular community, who received the basic income because it was a saturation site, had that effect of suddenly having a voice and a degree of autonomy in a relationship, in a family situation that they hadn't had before. It doesn't always necessarily lead to an exit, from the wedding, from the marriage, or from the family. I think actually that result from the 1970s was later shown to be a statistical blip. It wasn't really a consistent result that there was more divorce as a result of the basic income. But what it means is, the first step to resolving problems or tension in a marriage is just having voice, right? So having the money, having that independent amount of money with which women could purchase things that they wanted to purchase, invest in things they wanted to invest in, that already changes the dynamic in a relationship, maybe enough so that an exit from the relationship isn't necessary. But the other thing that we found in India was that many women who were part of farming families didn't consider themselves farmers, right? The husbands were the farmers, and they just considered themselves wives or housewives. And when in fact, we know in farming families and farming communities, everybody's pitching in lots of different ways to produce what is produced by the farm. But the fact that they had a little bit of money that they could make some decisions about meant that they saw themselves as farmers. They saw themselves as business people, as entrepreneurs, because they were able to invest in a sewing machine or in some livestock or contribute to building a fishery or something else. So their identity changed from being, kind of dependent, in terms of the marriage, but also economically, to being, a player in the economy. So in addition to the income effects that had from being able to invest in a productive tool or a productive activity that brought in more income than even the basic income, they had a sense of themselves as economic agents. And that kind of feeling, has spillover effects beyond the end of the experiment. The other thing that we saw, again, in developing economies was a greater investment in the health and nutrition and well-being of children, and particularly girls, including in increased years of schooling for girls.
Fascinating. Thank you. So I want to pick up on that point of in many other places where this has been piloted, there's been the ability to have a saturation, as you call it, and have a more universal benefit that goes to everyone in a particular usually geographic location. In the United States, that would be fairly difficult to do. We've already talked about the fact that typically social policy programs in the US are means tested. So you have to prove that you are below a particular income line, don't have, don't exceed a certain number of assets in order to be eligible for most of our programs. And we have this thing that colloquially we call the benefits cliff, right? So that if you get too many benefits, then suddenly that counts as too many assets and you may lose one benefit. This can be an issue where one may want to actually move up in the job ladder and take a increased wage, but not be able to take that because maybe that increased wage doesn't include health benefits and you might lose your health benefits because you'll hit that benefits cliff, right? So what was the story, Mayor Carter, with dealing with the benefits cliff when it came to guaranteed income in St. Paul? How did you navigate this? Did it put participants in the program potentially above that line where they might lose other critical things like housing or healthcare?
Yes, Christina. I mean, and this was one of the biggest kind of critiques that we got when we proposed this, is people would say, how are you going to avoid crossing participants across this line? And we had to create what we call like a benefits counseling system, where we created this kind of online system where families could look and enter their information and come up with like what this might do for their kind of public benefits. And we did have a handful of families who made the determination not to proceed and not to participate in our trial because they were concerned about what impact that would have on their benefits. Now, I would say, one, we're still giving families the ability to choose for themselves which road is better for them. But moreover, my response to them would always be, the problem in this scenario isn't that we're helping families buy groceries, families with young children buy groceries. The problem is that we've created in America, and again, we always talk about poverty as though it's like some force of nature that it's God created, but it's man-made. This is a perfect example of how poverty is man-made. We have created help. We have created benefits programs that require you to be more poor, that require you to be more broke, that require you to have less money in such a way that it makes single moms who are working full-time, who are struggling to make ends meet, struggling to feed their children, make them have to think twice whether they can accept $500 more to pay the rent or feed their children at the end of the month. That plays out in the form of guaranteed income trials, but moreover, it plays out in the form of every city in our country where people are trying to figure out, can I afford to take this raise? Can I afford to accept this new job? Can I afford to accept this promotion or these additional hours at work? This is our public policy environment creating the revolving door that keeps people stuck in cycles of poverty. This is exactly what structural racism, what structural inequity that impacts low-income Americans, that impacts Americans of color, that impacts women in our country every single day looks like. And so our response was always, yes, we're going to do the benefits counseling system. Yes, we're going to let families be in their own driving seat. But no, we're not going to accept this as a weakness of our system or as a reason we shouldn't help families make ends meet. This is a reason we should fundamentally change the way our eligibility criteria work so that we're not actually writing into law disincentives for families to seek upward economic mobility.
So this raises a bigger question, right? So
Mhm.
I know that one of the objectives of St. Paul was to try to, and of the variety of basic income, guaranteed income projects across the country, was to push this up into a more national discussion. Yet we have particular social policy structures in place that then put up roadblocks like Mayor Carter has just described. What would we need to do? What would need to happen in order for programs like guaranteed income or universal basic income to be able to be scaled up to larger levels beyond the local level? And I'm throwing that for whoever would like to jump in on that question.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I would say that we know what the answers are. Mayor Carter has just mentioned a few of them. Number one of the biggest benefit cliffs we have is for Medicaid. We need universal health care. There's just no two ways around it. And we can keep pretending as long as we like that we don't, but we do. And if we could get health care separated from these other means tested programs, then we would be eliminating one of the biggest benefit cliffs out there. And in terms of some of the other programs, I certainly do not agree with the right-wing view that a basic income should, be offered instead of all the other kinds of programs that we have. But the truth is that many of those other programs are income tested, means tested, and so if we are able to channel more money to individuals and families through a guaranteed income or basic income, then some of those programs will start to shrink and to fall by the wayside. And as Dr. Carter said earlier, right, food stamps don't help somebody who has access to food but doesn't have childcare or doesn't have a working car to get to work. So we need to shift more of what we do, and we're already doing a lot. We're just doing it in these fragmented ways that don't complement each other, but actually in some ways contradict each other or constrain each other. We need to channel more of the support that we're giving to low-income Americans to cash, to unconditional cash, and to increase the amounts that we give, and then to remove the specific, limited cases where cash doesn't work as well as providing the service in kind or in a more structured way, as in healthcare.
Dr. Castro, would you add anything to what Dr. Zelleke has already said?
Yeah, sure. I think that there's two things I'd add. So one, I think sometimes, so first of all, I mean, the benefits cliff issue in my center, we're running 27 experiments right now, and it is the thing that consistently keeps me up at night, just sort of trying to resolve that policy issue. And it's an ethical issue for us, right? Is that, wanting to make sure first that we're not doing any harm, and that people are able to make that choice as to whether or not they want to participate in a treatment group, but knowing full well that that could be a risk for them. That's a major deal. But first I just want to say that if we don't if we keep pushing on and we keep talking about benefits, and that's important, right? So talking about benefits cliff is crucial. Talking about the public sector's role in this is crucial. But the other piece of it is really bringing along the employment sector and talking about what is their responsibility in terms of talking about poverty and living wage, right? Is that you can't just expect that we're going to absorb all these gaps just through basic income or just through cash. I just want to throw that out there, that it's not a silver bullet. We could design it as perfectly as we want to. We could eliminate the benefits cliff and people still don't have access to affordable housing and a living wage. We're going to hit a ceiling. There's going to be a limit to what it is that we can do. The second thing I'd say is that in addition to, we don't just have we have these thresholds, right, of the benefits cliff. It's not just that though. it's also these constructions of shame and blame that we attach to it that have been very intentional. Like that sort of social construction of the welfare cream that was intentionally crafted to dissuade people from accessing benefits they were eligible for and should get simply because they're human is very durable. So I think as we have this broader conversation about policy and how do we do it, and how do we craft it, and what are the questions, at the same time, we also want to dismantle that narrative and challenge it, because otherwise we're just going to migrate those narratives from one program to basic income, which is the last thing that we want to see. And so one of the things that's really exciting about a lot of the work that's happening right now is people are placing equal emphasis on addressing those broader discourse, culture questions alongside technical questions of the benefits cliff, because all those benefits cliff questions, those are operationalizing ideas and stereotypes that we have about women and people of color, and we're writing it into policy. And so I think we have to own that and talk about that they're not just accidents, like Mayor Carter was saying, it's just a sort of force of nature, just happened to be. No, those are laws reflecting our bias. So we need to dismantle and challenge those alongside the other work that we're doing.
Okay, let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. Marching orders right there. I want to pivot a little bit, but staying on the same theme in terms of some of the impacts of these policies. And because this is part of a women's health series as well, I want to shift to some health questions. Mayor Carter, you mentioned that 80% of participants in this program are families of color. We've mentioned that it's focused on families with newborns, so a lot of mothers and children in this sample. On a biannual basis, my center publishes, in collaboration with the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, the status on women and girls in Minnesota. And every year when we come out with that study, we show significant gender disparities, especially when they intersect with race and ethnicity in the state. And some of our research shows that there's huge healthcare affordability challenges, especially for Black and Latina women in the state. And so especially implementing this program in the midst of a pandemic, did that play at all into your thinking in terms of spinning up this program and guaranteed income as potentially being a tool for health equity specifically?
Absolutely. I mean, and one of the things I think that we're learning is that health isn't just something that happens in a hospital setting. Health is something that has to happen in community. We've been talking about the social determinants of health for quite some time, and this acknowledgement that one of the most fatal illnesses you can have in America is poverty. And because all of the impacts that poverty has on our stress, all of the impacts that poverty has on every aspect of life, are just so profound. One of the things my grandfather used to always say, that if experience won't teach you, then nothing will. And my hope is that we've learned over the course of this last 20 months or so, since the beginning of the pandemic, what so many people have said for so long before that as long as one member of our community can't afford a stable home to shelter in place, as long as one member of our community can't afford to go to the doctor the moment they have symptoms, or to stay home from work for 2 weeks to care for a sick child, that we're all less safe because of it. And the impact on individual economics to individual health are profound, but then the impacts, the implications from individual health to community health are profound as well, as this pandemic has well shown. And Martin Luther King said that's what he was talking about when he said this inescapable web of mutuality. Our late Senator Paul Wellstone said, we all do better when we all do better. There have been the voices who have said that, but we've test driven it now as a country who spent the last 20 months immersed in this web of mutuality that we're all in together. And absolutely the notion of saying, how do we bring families to a better place? How do we bring mothers? How do we bring babies? How do we bring individuals in our community to a better place financially? And what are all of the impacts, health-wise, employment-wise, and all of these other types of impacts that we think we can have on our community through that? We're nothing but excited to see that first year of results come out of Stockton that have proven that this is the most promising intervention that I've ever seen with that kind of independent evaluation. And that's one of the things that I think is really cool about this, We have spent a lifetime trying to battle poverty and trying to battle public safety policy and all those types of things based on some anecdote that somebody's uncle told them when they were a child, as opposed to saying, what is the data telling us? What is independent research telling us? And this is a space where the independent research is actually very, very loud and clear that we can fundamentally shift how we approach children and families, how we approach alleviating poverty in America. People look at us like this is crazy and strange and new. And my response is always, to me, what's crazy is that we're 60 years into a war on poverty and giving money to poor people still feels new.
Dr. Castro, tell us more about the independent evaluation of Stockton, and specifically if you saw impacts on health inequalities as a result of their guaranteed income pilot.
Yeah, so there's a lot that we will be releasing in the future. I think probably the most salient finding from the first year were the changes that we saw in well-being. So one of the things that we did was everybody who participates, both treatment and control, they answer the same baseline survey. And one of the things that was included in there was a standard measure of anxiety and depression that most of us have taken at the doctor's office. At the beginning of the experiment, almost everybody in the treatment and control group met the clinical criteria for likely to have a mental health disorder and either anxiety or depression. Fast forward 1 year, and that treatment group had shifted completely into the category of likely to be well. And again, this was an unconditional cash transfer program. We did nothing except give people cash. In comparison, the control group continued to hover around that mark. And that jumps out to me. Two things jump out to me for that. First, the fact that the majority of people met the clinical criteria for anxiety, depression simply based on poverty alone ought to just stop us cold. I mean, that is utterly ridiculous. That's just staggering to me. And second, the fact that it shifted so quickly. I mean, we weren't surprised by those findings, right? So people often tell us, were you surprised that you saw a reduction? No, we weren't surprised. That's why we made it the hypothesis. What was a surprise was how quickly it took place. And I think that that's really exciting. Now, how well that will hold up over time, that's really a mystery. We don't know. That's only 1 year worth of data. And there's certainly lots of things that we'll be doing in the coming years to figure that out. But as a first step, I think that's pretty telling. The second thing I'd say is that, we've known for a long time from public health research that inequality gets under the skin, right? You can take 1, 2, 3 years of financial stress and you're not going to see huge shifts in public health outcomes. But once you hit that 5-year mark and beyond, those failures of capitalism live in the body. They show up as a lowered life expectancy, people getting chronic diseases earlier in the lifespan. And we know that women who are performing unpaid care work carry an even stronger burden. And on top of that, those who are absorbing risk in the economy in other ways. And so when we look at that Stockton data and we see, yes, it's this one little data point of, these shifts in anxiety and depression, but you think about the power of that and the potential it might hold if you're talking about broader groups of people or extending that money for a longer period of time. I think it shows great promise. The other thing that I'd say on the health and well-being front is, again, we saw people being able to specifically women for the most part, being able to leverage that money and direct it towards themselves in a form of self-care in a way that they hadn't before. And so I don't mean that in this sort of, like terrible blog sense of I went and got a pedicure, although if somebody did, power to them. Like we want people to be human, right? When I say that, I mean women specifically prioritizing themselves when they would say things to us like, I've never taken times for myself and listened to what I actually want or what I actually need. Right. And so some of that is preventative healthcare, of course, right? But some of that is just being human and being able to say, how do I show up as a partner, as a parent in the community, right? Those are all part and parcel of health and well-being. And so while we have those very hard numbers on anxiety and depression, I would encourage anybody who's interested to look at our report and read some of the qualitative data where people describe how that money functioned in a way to improve things that are almost intangible about health and well-being.
And I think we are all so familiar now with what it means to have underlying health issues in the pandemic context and how much that meant so much greater vulnerability to the COVID-19 virus. And so it's always an important issue, but now we should recognize it more than ever. Dr. Zelleke, have you found in the related research in other places impacts on health and well-being?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll just touch on three examples here. One was that in the 1970s, Manitoba in Canada also had a guaranteed income pilot, as several states and localities did in the United States during that time. And the results were heavily focused on health outcomes. And it was, very strong, the data, the correlation with receipt of the guaranteed income in the small rural community in Manitoba, and better health outcomes, better health outcomes for years, including years after the end of the income, including in, for example, delayed childbirth for children, for girls who had been children when the income pilots had started. Another example is in South Africa. It's a little bit different. It was not a basic income pilot, but in South Africa, after the end of apartheid, a number of senior citizens, African-American or African senior citizens, Black senior citizens in South Africa became eligible for a pension. And the finding showed that if there was a grandmother in a household who was eligible for one of these pensions, that the health outcomes for all the children, her grandchildren, improved significantly. So women are using their money ideally to help care for themselves, as Dr. Castro mentioned, but it's also clear that they just channel that money into their families, and the health outcomes there were very clear. The third was a kind of a natural experiment that took place in the United States. So again, not a guaranteed income or basic income pilot, but there was an ongoing study of children in North Carolina that was looking at both white children and Native American children. And during the time of the study, the Native American children became beneficiaries of casino dividends because of the laws changing around casinos. And what was found is that, for the children who were in families that were receiving these casino dividends, with a comparison to the control group of white children who were not eligible for them, the health outcomes were much stronger for the children, and were particularly strong for the children who were, they looked at different cohorts, but the children who were 12 years old when those benefits started, which was the youngest cohort that they were looking at, they had the strongest outcomes. And again, those outcomes persisted into adulthood. So the evidence is pretty clear that more money, less poverty, for children leads to better health outcomes. It's really not controversial. So if we're worried about that data point, we should put that one to rest.
So that's a nice segue to a question we have from an audience member. Dr. Rahel Nardos, who's a professor in our School of Public Health, has a question for Dr. Zelleke, where she asks, in cultures with more pronounced gender inequities, have there been situations where the women did not actually have control over the individual universal income, even if on paper they're supposed to? So I'm thinking about that South Africa pension example you had that went to the children. Are there cases where maybe a woman would like to use it for themselves and instead they don't actually have control?
Well, in the pilots around basic income that were implemented in, there was one in Namibia as well as South Africa that were saturation sites. There were other organizations that were participating in the pilots. So in India, the Self-Employed Women's Association was one of the founding members of the pilot, and so they also did a control with villages where CWA was active compared to villages where CWA wasn't. Right, so villages where CWA was active already had some kind of organizational structure for women who did some piecework or small scale agricultural production on their own, and were gaining income from it. So certainly I would say I don't have a direct answer to that question. I'd have to go back and look at the data to see if there's anything there, but I think that we could probably assume that we don't need just the income. We also need some of the surrounding structures to help women in particular who might be at risk of being facing some form of domination from fathers or boyfriends or husbands, that we have other structures in place to support them. So that they really have control over their money. But that would be true for basic income or any other kind of benefit for that matter.
So now I'm going to shift a bit and say, we haven't had a question from the audience, but there may be audience members wondering, is guaranteed income or universal basic income or basic income, are these just handouts? Are they things that are going to be a disincentive for people to work? And I'm certainly, that is something we hear on a regular basis, skeptics of these programs. What is your answer to the skeptics of programs like these? Mayor Carter, do you want to start?
I've heard that a lot, and never from someone who could quit their day job for $500 a month. And that's always intriguing to me, because I always ask that question and say, well, no, not me. And it's interesting that we, I'm in Minnesota, so sometimes we say interesting, but we really mean something else. It's offensive for someone to suggest that, someone, would someone else can live in these meager conditions that they would never consider subjecting their own children to. When in fact, and I'll let, I'm probably the least qualified person to speak on this, but one of the things that we're excited about, the least qualified person on this call at least, but one of the things that excites me is the research that we saw out of Stockton that showed that the participants in the experimental group, those who received the benefit, were actually twice as likely to move into full-time employment as those who didn't. And as we've talked to folks, as our researchers talk to folks there, and as we talk to folks anecdotally here in St. Paul, that's exactly what we're hearing. And it's sort of obvious, because people say, well, I can put my child in childcare now. I can get my car fixed up. I can get a suit for the interview. I can take a day off of my job I'm at now and go interview. And we're seeing all of those ways in which it's actually quite the opposite. And this is where, again, we, I think, fall short when our policies are guided by those kind of old tales that people kind of buy into, and they sound great, they sound obvious because they're so simple. But at some point, that's why we have research, so we can test a statement like that and say, well, no, actually, quite the opposite has proven true. Unfortunately, science and data is suddenly this kind of controversial thing in the American political discourse. But to the extent that we believe research, science, and data, we're able to have a really simple conversation with folks. Again, thanks to Dr. Castro and Dr. Zelleke and people like them who kind of help us do this. And I think thanks to this national network of mayors that we've created to say, well, let's find out, let's see what the impacts are. And I think the ability to say, listen, in Stockton, California, and in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Atlanta, Georgia, and in Los Angeles, and all these other places around the country, here's what the actual outcomes actually have been. It gives us a chance to, I think, have a fundamentally different conversation, both in our state capitals and in Washington, D.C.
So, Dr.
Castro, did I get it? Did I get it even close to right? Tell me.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, we did. We saw those who were in the treatment group, they moved from 28% full-time employment at the start of the experiment to 1 year later, 40% in full-time employment. And people did exactly what you described, is that they had, it was able to reduce material barriers to full-time employment, like childcare or being able to take that shift off of work. And then the other piece was really opening up some capacity. Like, financial scarcity creates time scarcity, right? And if all of your energy is going towards managing scarcity, you don't have the time to take a breath and imagine an alternative pathway, let alone take a step on it, right? So that's one piece of it. But I love the way that you frame the question around handouts, right? Because we have no problem giving handouts to the wealthy in the form of tax returns, and like the way that we sort of give handouts to corporate America is just pretty stinking obvious. We only talk about it as a handout when we're talking about people who are on the losing end of capitalism, and then suddenly it becomes a handout, which is just, to me, is funny, and that the way that we attach deservedness to people based on how much they produce within a market economy that frankly is problematic and leaving most Americans behind. The other thing I'd say about that I find interesting is, when it comes to the employment data, it's like, I want to talk about it, right? Is it because it's something that's so salient, and I think rightfully so. It's a question that's on the public's mind, right? Like, people want to know, and I think that that's a valid thing. They want to know, is this working? Are people going to stop working? Things to that effect. But by the same token, Americans work too much, right? So if I see people in our treatment groups stop working 60 hours a week and instead start working 40 hours a week, I'm not going to be upset about that, right? Like, we know that when people overwork, it shows up in all sorts of maladaptive ways relationally, in terms of their health, their well-being, who they are as people. And one of our driving questions as a research team is, can we unlock potential, right? Like what potential, what human potential are we leaving off the table when people are trapped in work that's not meaningful? So like, yeah, I mean, like I get this question a lot, and I think it's an important one that we have to continue to tackle and interrogate. But it's also one of those things where as an issue of language and sort of thinking about Americans' obsession with work, I find it like kind of problematic. And one of the things that's been really helpful for me is like having conversations with colleagues from around the globe, and specifically those from Europe, who really challenge me. Like there's a lot of philosophers of basic income, in the EU that really push back on these questions. And I'm always thankful for it. And I have to find better ways to ask these questions in my research. I'm sure that Dr. Zelleke has some wonderful things to add to that point.
Well, Dr. Castro and I think, talked about this on some other panels we've been on together. But so I agree with everything that's been said by both Mayor Carter and Dr. Castro. I guess I'll just focus on one thing in particular. If we're talking about women, the evidence is that women work whether they get paid for it or not. There's so much unpaid work that women have done for decades. And not only is it unpaid, but it comes at tremendous opportunity cost, because doing unpaid care means you can't be earning income, right? So there's some things that we do that really just don't have any relation to how much money we make from them. And that's the truth about a lot of jobs. People work for many reasons other than just because they want income. So we should be thinking about jobs holistically and not just in terms of the money they bring in. But I think, it's reasonable for taxpayers, let's say, to think, well, if everybody just gets basic income and then nobody works, well, who's going to pay the taxes? They're going to pay for the basic income. How will it be sustainable? So that's where I think it's important to think about how we're financing the basic income, as well as what the benefit might be. Because we just, for a moment ago, we're talking about benefit cliffs, right? So we shouldn't pretend that there would be no benefit cliff or earning cliff if we structured the basic income in such a way that people lose the entire basic income if they make $1 of earned income. Well, then maybe some people will decide that, yeah, they'd rather live on the $500 than to take the job that pays them minimum wage under terrible conditions when they don't have childcare or a car to get to work anyway. So we want to be sure that we structure the guaranteed income or the basic income in such a way that we're not creating that kind of a cliff, that to the extent that the basic income is being sort of clawed back from people, it's clawed back at very, very high levels of income, right? Higher than average income, at a place where income is bundled up in salaries that come with benefits and at future trajectories, rather than at the hourly wage stage, right? So you don't want to have, a dollar for dollar or a 50 cent for 50, for dollar, or 30 cent per dollar reduction in the basic income or the guaranteed income for every earned dollar. That's higher than wealthy people pay in taxes, right? You want the basic income to stay there as people earn income well into the middle class at a point, as I said, where the attachment to the job is not just about the income that it brings in, but it's about all sorts of other things. And that's why I would think, actually, we want to be starting to talk about a basic income financed by wealth tax rather than an income tax. We want people who want to go out and earn more income, they should get the rewards of that work. It's really all of the accumulated wealth that is now so disproportionately controlled by such a small number of people. That's what we should be mining for the basic income.
So, Dr. Zelleke, that is some people might push back and say, whoa, you're going to give out a basic income up until the point people are in the middle class. Whereas we've just been having the conversation, maybe it should be limited to even fewer people, would be what naysayers would respond. Why are you making this argument, especially from a gender equity point of view? So what does it give us to expand the pool as you are advocating? This is a much bigger pool that you're advocating than the 150 people in St. Paul that are receiving this program right now. What kinds of impacts in terms of gender equity would that give us if we expanded the pool in the way that you describe?
Oh, so many. I mean, we've been talking, throughout the session on the fact that women have disproportionate responsibility for many kinds of care, not just, childcare or elder care, but even the kinds of things that Dr. Castro was talking about, just sort of running a household, keeping a household going. So we want, I think we want a society in which everybody has the means necessary for life, right? Nobody lives in absolute poverty. All children, grow up with their nutritional needs met and their needs for shelter and care met. Beyond that, I think we do want a society in which people, join the market and work for earned income as well, not only to supplement their own incomes, but to contribute in ways that jobs and the marketplace contributes to higher standards of living for all of us. And I think we want to do that in a way where we're not asking people to choose. Either you get the basic income, and then the minute you start earning money, that goes away. I think we want to do it in such a way that everyone is encouraged to work part-time-ish. And that would mean, if we're just taking a traditional couple, that both parents work and do care, and that's supported by a basic income, rather than creating a situation where one person has to forego the basic income because if they got it, they'd lose the benefit because of their earnings. And the other person is afraid to go out and work because to do so would mean that they'd lose the basic income. You want everybody to have both and to have access to both. And yes, I do think that should go much higher into the middle class than we've been talking about it so far, generally speaking, in the guaranteed income pilots in the United States. And I would say we only have to look at some of the most successful programs we have in the United States to see why. Programs like Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, and the stimulus payments that we all, just got. Those all go way into the middle class and into the upper middle class in some cases. And those are incredible programs in terms of poverty alleviation. Social Security is the #1 poverty alleviation program we've had, and it's not directed at poverty alleviation, because if it were, it would be directed to the poor in this, these detrimental ways, and it wouldn't actually work. But because it's a broad-based program, that's funded with broad-based taxes, it serves that poverty alleviation effect in addition to the particular support of the retired population that it's supposed to do. Same is true of Medicare, same is true of unemployment insurance, which is not means tested, and the stimulus payments, which were means tested, but at a very high income, not at, Dr. Castro maybe can correct me, but around $100,000 of income a year, and not at 20,000 or 15,000, which is when we typically see these benefit cliffs for programs that are targeted to the poor.
And we're seeing that something similar to that with the child tax credit.
Of course, how could I forget that one?
Yeah, yeah. So very interesting. First time that I've had a government check arrive on my dining room table on a regular basis. So
if I could just add that
Sure.
the fact that you just said that is so important, because it takes the stigma away, right? We're all getting these child tax credit checks if we have children, right? And that takes the stigma away. It's not just for poor people. It's a recognition that raising children is expensive and that it has some aspects of being a public good, right? It's a private good for families, but has some aspects of being a public good because this is our future generation of workers, of leaders, of parents, of teachers, of educators, of everybody.
If only it had happened when my kids were in daycare, when it is the cost of sending a child to university, daycare in the state of Minnesota, as it is in much of the country. We have a question from one of our master's students here at the Humphrey School, who is wondering if the guests can talk more about accountability in the labor market with regard to livable wages. So in other words, how can we push employers to be accountable to pay living wages so that UBI isn't having to do the biggest lift? Who would like to take that question?
I'll start. I don't know that we have the answer. I don't know that any of us can give you the answer on that one, but it's so important. It's so critical. I'll tell you, one of the things that my family is tired of hearing me talk about is when we go to the restaurant, we see the 3% or the 18% or the 20% surcharge so they can offer their employees a living wage or health care, as though that should be like considered an extra add-on thing. And I'm the guy who leaves the little notes on the receipt saying I'd rather you just raise your prices by 18% so that we can just normalize people having healthcare, being able to go to the doctor when they're sick in our economy. But this is so critical, and especially right now as we talk about, as we have this public discourse around what I commonly read about. I don't believe that there's really a workforce shortage right now, but I'm always reading about this this notion of a workforce shortage. When in fact, I think what's happening is people are redoing the calculus around what they can, if they can afford to take low wage jobs at a federal minimum wage. And thankfully, we've raised the minimum wage here in St. Paul, and our sister city, Minneapolis, our twin city, Minneapolis, has raised their minimum wage as well. It was one of the promises that I came into office with. But at a federal minimum wage that hasn't changed in years. If the goal of having a minimum wage in the first place, if the whole reason we say, hey, there should be a minimum wage is so that we can create a floor of how children grow up in America, of how families have to live in America, well, then our current minimum wage is just a failure. I believe we need our minimum wage. We've established a $15 minimum wage here in St. Paul. I think that should be a statewide minimum wage. I think that should be a federal minimum wage that's national. So I think that is something that's very important. It goes back though to some of the kind of whether we're all in it together or whether we are all on our own type of policies, as we were talking about, universal health care and some of those types of things that we have to determine. I think far beyond just guaranteed income, we have to fight, I think, at our capitals and in Washington, D.C. and in city halls across America to establish as an ethos that healthcare, the ability to go to the doctor when you're sick, shouldn't be something you have to wake up every day and earn. That should be something that is just a birthright of the American people, a birthright in this country, a birthright in a civilized society, as it is in very many other civilized nations, as it is in very many other places around the globe. So I think that's a long-term fight that we have to continue to push. Our goal is to push on those things at the local level. I told you, my mantra that we all have to be able to afford our home. So we're putting money into affordable housing and home ownership and raising the minimum wage and college savings accounts and all these types of things to put money in families' pockets. So we all have to know that we all can afford to kind of go to the doctor, that when we get sick, we all have to be able to afford to take 2 weeks off of work. And so it's important for us to lead by example in the institutions that we lead and in the spaces that we control. And that's why in St. Paul, we've adopted a lot of those policies.
Do Dr. Castro or Dr. Zelleke want to add anything to that?
I think the mayor said it quite well. I mean, the only thing I would add to that is that like a ditto, right? But also saying, one of the things that I think is phenomenal about cash is that it gives people a sense of agency. And so we've the system set up right now where people have no choice. It's sort of a matter of survival, and it's ridiculous during the COVID, of course, where people are like, I have to go to work even though I know it's not safe, even though the wages aren't high enough, right? Like that's really, really problematic. And so to me, those of us who are doing work in this basic income space have to take care that we're not having tunnel vision around unconditional cash as though it will just sort of solve these broader issues when it won't. And so I think there's a real policy limit to what cash can do. And when it comes to living wages, I think that that's part of it. So it can and this is conjecture because we don't have this yet in the data, but what I know so far from setting these programs and pilots up is that it does infuse a sense of agency and allows people to be a little bit choosier about the type of work they're going to do or not do, right? Which I think is really key. And to me, one of the driving questions, both on the labor market side, but then also on the basic income side, is this question of who do we grant choice to, right? Why do we only grant choice to those that are on the winning side of capitalism, right? Like we just shrink choices for people that are on the bottom. And then we wonder why folks remain stuck and they lack upward mobility.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that's been said already on this. I do think that the evidence from the, again, it was a long time ago, but the 1970s pilots was that primary earners in that time period, mostly men, worked slightly fewer hours as a result of getting the income, which seemed to be the result of being a little choosier between gigs. rather than taking the first thing that came, to them, and that secondary workers did reduce their hours. So I do think that we should recognize that actually, a basic income could induce some people to leave the workforce or to reduce their hours, but that shouldn't be a bad thing. The other thing that basic income does is it allows workers to be choosier. And so that's one way of nudging employers to do the right thing and raise wages. But I agree, we need some policy efforts as well in that direction. And we need employers to take a little bit more responsibility. As consumers, we also have to be willing to pay a little bit more for our goods. As Dr. Carter was saying, we shouldn't expect things to be as cheap as they are. We shouldn't expect food, for example, the food that we get in grocery stores to be as cheap as it is, because it's a high cost to the people who actually pick our produce, that we have such cheap food in this country, which is not true in, say, European countries.
So,
And if I can just plug in there, that's an example of what you were saying, Dr. Zelleke, and I really appreciate you bestowing my doctorate upon me a couple of times here today. I'll take it. I appreciate it. But it's a function of us. It's that when businesses get to take advantage of full-time labor and without paying the full price that's needed for that labor force to feed their children, to access healthcare, to have stable housing, then that's a public subsidy of government. That's a public subsidy of private businesses. And it goes right back to, I think, what you were just saying earlier, that when we provide public subsidy to businesses, that is very much accepted and approved, and part of we don't even really discuss it much. But should we decide we want to provide $500 a month to help low-income moms make sure there's food on the table, all of a sudden that's this controversial thing that we have to have conversations like this to justify.
So in our remaining time, I want to move us to really, what do we do with this conversation, especially when it comes to Minneapolis, which I understand is thinking about a similar guaranteed income project, maybe very different. I'm not sure. I'm not in conversation with Minneapolis, but I hope that they're listening in, because I would like you to tell folks in Minneapolis that may be thinking about designing a project and guaranteed income, what's the takeaway from both St. Paul and the Stockton project, about how to, and from not just St. Paul and the Stockton project, but from other pilots that we've heard about today from around the world. What's the best way to structure these kinds of programs, especially if we want to advance gender equity and its intersections with race and class and other forms of inequalities? Maybe start with what hasn't worked. That might be quite interesting. We've talked a lot about the great things. What should they avoid? And then what should they do?
Well, I think what hasn't worked is probably the easiest piece of that question to take on. Folks ask me on occasion when they feel like this feels like a fundamentally new approach to helping people connect with money. It's like, why are we doing it this way? Why are we changing our approach? And my response is, I turn on the question, like, give me one reason why we should continue fighting poverty in the way that we have in America for the past, forever. We're clearly not experiencing the outcomes that we desire. So we have to turn the corner. I know there's a number of folks in Minneapolis who are thinking about this and who are focused on this. And I talked to the mayor about this quite a bit. And I think they're well underway where this is concerned. But I think the first step is understanding that we have to be willing to try fundamentally new approaches where this is concerned. When we think about the last 20 months that we've been in this pandemic, I don't know that there's anyone who could tell you that they expected this pandemic to be as wide-ranging, as widespread in its impact, or as long-lasting as it has been. And if we're going to bring something forward, and this is part of our argument when we built this program as a part of our COVID dollars, and as we are working with other cities around the country to justify being able to use American Rescue Plan dollars for it, if we're going to call something a response to the pandemic, if we know that this pandemic was bigger and it was more long lasting than anything we ever could have imagined a year and a half ago, well, then the only case that exists is for a response, if we're going to call it a response, to be something that is bigger, that is more profound, that is more impactful, that's more transformative, and that's more long lasting than anything we could have maybe imagined 2 years ago. That's what we're doing. And again, it's an enormous response, and it has to be, because we understand the extent to which every family, every single family in America, every single family on the planet has experienced crisis and trauma over the course of this past year. So our advice to any city thinking about this is be bold, go big, and you'll probably be surprised by how many people in your community understand the need and support it at the core.
Thanks.
But would one of the researchers give a real answer?
that was a real answer. I'll throw out a couple things. First, one aspect that we haven't touched on yet today is really the community-based nature of the work that's being done within MGI, within a lot of these pilots, and St. Paul specifically. So part of the reason that St. Paul worked, and part of the reason Stockton worked, right, is that human contact and relationship is in some ways the secret sauce, and in a lot of ways, human contacts become a bit of a luxury good. And so people oftentimes arrive at the idea of basic income out of an obsession with efficiency. How can we reduce the number of this and increase the number of that, right? And the reality is, like, at the end of the day, these programs are being targeted towards people who've been told by every single institution, you don't matter. And in fact, you only matter if we can extract wealth and assets from you, right? And so there's a tremendous amount of relational work that's necessary to get these projects off the ground. And part of the reason that St. Paul has gone well and Stockton's gone well and some other cities have gone well is that their mayoral teams and community-based organizations have taken the time to listen to constituents and say, who do you think needs to be prioritized in this program? What are the concerns and questions that you have? And, with Stockton, I'll say, like, I did the researcher thing and built a beautiful design with my co-PI and all the smartest brains I could find. And I took it back to the community and they were like, that's not gonna work. And they were right. And had we not incorporated the feedback from everyday people, our design really would have fallen flat, and we wouldn't be where we are now, not only with the data, but in some of the other sites. And so that would really be the first one, is to follow in Mayor Carter's footsteps and take the time to listen to people, and not in sort of just a one-off, like, hey, here's a town hall where you can write on an index card. I mean, in a real power sharing way, saying, like, who do you want to be at this table? I think that's absolutely needs to be number one. Number two is again the unconditional nature of it. Folks always want to add things to cash, and similar to Mayor Carter, people are like, well, why aren't you adding financial coaching? Why aren't you adding literacy? Why aren't you adding job training? I'm like, we know what all those things do. Very little. What we don't know yet is what cash does and how far it can go. And so leaning into that unconditional nature would be the second piece. And then third, obviously I'm biased in saying this because I'm a researcher, but I think attaching some form of research to it for those who are considering pilots, I think is really, really crucial. One of the things that's exciting about these mayors is that you have people who are saying, yes, the public is saying we don't believe science, we distrust science, but instead what we have are young mayors and mayors of color saying we are going to lead with empiricism. And I think that is one of the most exciting things, is that at a time when there's tremendous distrust of institutions, we can on the one hand prioritize community voice and hold that in tandem with strong science. And there's lots of ways to do that.
Dr. Zelleke, what would you add? Would you say that they need to give the funds to individuals? You started us out with unconditionality and individual checks in terms of being important for gender equity. And would you add anything?
Well, I think that I guess the first thing is that the University of Minnesota should award an honorary doctorate to Mayor Carter, so I get his title correct, for all the work that he's done to bring attention to cash benefits. I guess the question is, what is it that we're trying to achieve with the pilots? And so I think I would disagree with Dr. Castro on this. I think we know what cash does. I don't think we actually need a lot more of these pilots to determine what cash does. I think to the extent that they have a purpose, it's in getting more people to understand the concept of unconditional cash and become more familiar with it, and to build awareness in communities where, for example, in the policy world or the academic community, we've been talking about this for a while, but maybe not in grassroots organizations. I think there are opportunities to build partnerships with local organizations that could become advocates for a permanent tax tax-funded basic income, either at the state level or at the federal level. One of the questions in the chat was about examples of places where maybe men do control the money and a basic income wouldn't go to women. So, we should think about that. How do we structure cash benefits so that they are targeting the people that they're intended to target? I would say that my sort of next steps, would be, because I focus on policy, be to think about the policy implementation. So I do think wherever we can individualize benefits before we have a basic income or a federal permanent guaranteed income, is to try to individualize benefits, try to reduce the conditionality on existing benefits, try to broaden the base of benefits to include as many people as possible. Look for opportunities to do even small things on a universal basis in your city or in your state. So Dr. Ewig, you spoke about the fact that, you're getting the child tax credit check. Now we're all getting this. So many of us got stimulus checks, right? And that creates a sense of belonging, a sense of unity. And I think we want to double down on that as much as we can. What those opportunities look like in particular cities or states, I would leave to local authorities to figure out. But I would be, if I were a public official, always be thinking about how to individualize, how to universalize, how to reduce conditions, how to pressure the federal government in those programs that are partnerships between the federal government and the state and local authorities to move in that direction, to pressure the federal government for waivers on specific programs to move in that direction, but to really start the implementation even before we have the legislation for a basic income.
So I'd like to give Mayor Carter the last word here. I've got one question in the 1 minute we have remaining. Your Office of Financial Empowerment has said that the objective here is not to have a St. Paul project. The objective here is to change state level policy and federal level policy and push this idea to the next levels of government. Have you had any success or any inklings of potential success of seeing moves towards basic guaranteed income at these levels?
I think we are seeing some success. I mean, the everything we just discussed, from the child tax credit, that work, I think, is a part of us normalizing this conversation nationwide. We've seen states like California, the governor of California, embrace this at a statewide level. And I do think that we're changing the narrative around these types of cash policies. I think we're changing the narrative. That's going to be long-term work. But I think we have a national network of people who are committed to it. So I'm excited to see. I mean, if you think about where this conversation has traveled in just the last year alone, let alone the last 2 years, it makes me really excited to think about where we could be 2 years from now.
All right. So with that, I want to extend a huge thank you to the 3 esteemed panelists that we've had here today. I think we've had a great discussion with some great questions as well for the audience. I want to thank the audience members for being with us today. We will have a recording available early next week of this webinar. We'll be uploading it to the Humphrey YouTube channel, and we're going to share a link with everyone who has registered, as well as through the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy newsletter. You can sign up for our newsletter on our website. All right, and with that, thank you everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.